By the time Sandy struck, there had already been 1 foot of observed sea level rise in New York City over the past century. And this 1 foot doesn't sound like much, but the extra foot of water is estimated to have added approximately $2 billion to Sandy's toll in the city and to have flooded the homes of 75,000 additional people in New York and New Jersey who would not have flooded in the absence of sea level rise. In New York Harbor, waters are rising at more than double the global average rate, and this is a rate that's set to increase exponentially over the coming decades. Talk of climate change adaptation tends to deploy militaristic language. So we hear attack, defend, retreat, and the dominant way of dealing with flooding has long been a combination of those first two. So you attack by building farther out into the water, you defend existing settlements with engineered structures that seek to accommodate or protect from flooding. To retreat, to not bother with hard defenses at all, but instead to get out of the way, is far less common and far more controversial. But it's also fast becoming far more necessary, as climate change makes it difficult to inhabit numerous places in their present form. But even in places with recurrent disasters, people generally don't relocate. And post-disaster policies in the US very much remain geared towards rebuilding homes and infrastructure in the same places where they were before. And there are lots of good reasons for this. We know losing a place entails multiple costs. Places have symbolic, cultural value, as well as financial value. For those of us in urban studies, the term managed retreat sounds uncomfortably close to disinvestment policies like managed decline and planned shrinkage that have served to reproduce and exacerbate racial inequality in cities. This image shows what became known as the green dot map of New Orleans neighborhoods that some planners and officials proposed converting into green space after Hurricane Katrina rather than rebuilding. And when the map was published in the local paper, it ignited fierce opposition, as you might expect, from residents and from others who really saw it as a continuation of urban renewal, once again targeting largely Black neighborhoods for demolition, but under the new guise of disaster recovery and quote unquote resilience planning. So in the weeks and months after Sandy, I watched as households all along the shore organized in favor of buyouts, essentially pleading with government officials to fund the demolition of neighborhoods that some of them had called home for generations. The buyout groups that emerged were concentrated in places that historically were wetlands. And these were also the deadliest places to be during the storm. Blame for the need for retreat, blame for flooding, in their view, lay largely with government. Unsurprisingly, many government officials did not view retreat in quite the same way. By contrast to Governor Cuomo, Mayor Bloomberg came out strongly against the idea of moving away from the water after Sandy. He described a retreat as a kind of moral failure, an abandonment of place, community, and identity, and a futile act considering the hundreds of thousands of people and billions of dollars in assets in the city's growing floodplain. Rather than unbuild and pay people to move in the face of growing risk, the city proposed to do the opposite, creating an acquisition for redevelopment program that offered homeowners like those in Staten Island who really wanted to move roughly the same amount of money for their homes, but allowed their land to then be auctioned off for redevelopment to the highest bidder who promised to rebuild in a more quote unquote flood resilient manner. And, in contrast, the state buyouts mandated that the land was left as, quote, natural open space in perpetuity. Ultimately, only a very small fraction of the people who sought buyouts wound up being included in the state's program and supported in their efforts to relocate. Many others were left in limbo, facing the threat of being forced out of their homes with little support and much to lose, whether through foreclosure, rising flood insurance rates, or the next storm. The challenge of the kind of community-driven approach to retreat is that demand for buyouts can and often does exceed the limited funding set aside for such programs. And this presents dilemmas for local officials who typically resist retreat due to the loss of housing. And in Staten Island, these are some of the last affordable homes that you can buy in New York City. That housing wasn't getting replaced elsewhere. They lose population, they lose property tax revenue. And especially if you have quote unquote holdouts who stay behind, you have to still, supply infrastructure services and so on. Cities are often left with the cost of maintaining the acquired land. And there are real concerns about setting a precedent when, as Mayor Bloomberg noted, it's impractical to retreat from everywhere that's prone to flooding. And I would add it's, completely impossible to retreat from climate change. There are many, many impacts beyond floods. On Staten Island, those who got a buyout were mostly white homeowners with the time to organize and the political power and connections to get their demands heard and met, at least to some degree, by the system as it stands. So they possessed what anthropologist Elizabeth Marino has termed adaptation privilege, afforded through policies such as buyouts that are premised on property ownership and thus tend to exclude the very historically oppressed and marginalized groups that are most impacted by disasters and by climate change. Like much mid-century housing, the new housing that went up in Staten Island's East and South Shores was largely off limits to African Americans. So the ability to become a homeowner there at all, who then after Sandy had at least a chance of getting resources to retreat on their own terms, was not distributed equally. And retreat policies that don't take into account the unequal and segregated landscapes that already exist threaten to increase inequity through the process of adaptation. And at the same time, even for those who were in a position of relative privilege, in one of the wealthiest cities, one of the wealthiest countries in the world, resources to retreat were hard to come by. And as thorny a challenge as retreat posed there, it's far thornier in places whose populations unjustly are bearing the brunt of climate change, despite contributing least to the emissions that have fueled warming. And we see across scales ranging from the local to the global, the issue of climate migration, of human movement, some of it forced, some of it fought for, emerging as a pivotal issue of environmental and climate justice. What it means to move and to leave one's land and one's home can be profound, even when the distance is short. And it varies dramatically in different contexts. So for Indigenous groups, for minoritized communities, remaining in place or relocating collectively while sustaining access to that place, access to traditional land, is a matter of sovereignty and cultural survival.